My reading for us this morning comes from the Reverend Paul Sawyer. The first time I ever played taps was at summer camp when I was 10 years old. That was the year I started playing trumpet, so I can only imagine how it sounded. I know there was no way I could have hit the high note near the end. The first time I played taps in honor of those who had died was in high school, when I was contacted by the local Legion commander. He asked if I would mind occasionally being called on to play taps at graveside services for veterans, and I agreed. For the next couple of years, when there was a need, I would take my place with the Legion Honor Guard, wait for the 3 volleys of shots to ring out, and play the simple 24 notes of taps as clearly and as best I could. Each time, the Legion commander would quietly slip me a $10 bill, and that's about all that taps meant to me for a while. It was easy to do, it got me out of school, and I earned a little money. And then one day that changed. The man I was called upon to play for that day was the father of one of my Boy Scout leaders. And back then, like most of the adults I knew, I thought my assistant scoutmaster was pretty old. But his father was a World War II veteran, so thinking back, that means that he and his father were relatively young, too young for their places there that morning, as the honored dead and as the grieving son. That day, as I began to play taps, this man who I knew as wise and kind and relatively hard in the old Boy Scout wilderness leader sort of way, fell to his knees overwhelmed with tears. I'm not sure how I made it through the whole piece that day, but after that I thought I might never be able to play taps again. Today, whether I'm playing it or hearing it, taps means something close to what it once meant, to the reasons for which it was written and originally used. Once upon a time, taps was a signal that the camp was relatively safe. It meant that you were not under siege or under attack of any kind. It meant that you were reasonably sure there were no enemy soldiers to worry about, at least a bugle's call away. To a whole camp of soldiers, the notes meant that unless you were on duty, you could close your eyes and sleep in peace. I didn't know that story or that sentiment all those years ago when I played for pocket money in the local cemetery. But in that meaning of taps, something speaks to me in my heart and soul about dying, and for those of us who remain, about remembering well. There are no good wars, not really. Ultimately, every war is a waste, an indication that we, fragile, fallible human beings, failed somewhere along the way. And perhaps that failure was historical and long ago, and perhaps the failure was last week. But regardless, every war is ultimately the result of a mistake. The problem, of course, and thousands of years of just war philosophy and theology support this, is that sometimes the mistake cannot be fixed or redeemed in any other way. Our errors may have long roots and deep history, so that by the time it comes, war feels inevitable, the unfolding consequences of what has come before. Today, we often talk about the Civil War as a good war more often than not. Contemporary historical discourse is complicated and nuanced and ambiguous, but we have resoundingly rejected the old Dunning School history that claimed the war was a tragedy that could have been averted. Memorial Day is expanded so that it now holds the memory of the dead from many conflicts, but it was born then, in the aftermath of that particular war. And there are many cities and groups that lay claim to the first post-war Decoration Day or Memorial Day, but the story as I told it earlier is, as near as I can tell, the truest one. And so, in 1865, those freed people in Charleston reburied soldiers properly and decorated their graves. 3 years later, General John Logan, victorious Union General John Logan, proclaimed a National Decoration Day in May. Other states and cities had their own dates and days to honor the dead of whichever side they had been on. And over time, Memorial Day became tangled with that old history in the attempt to paint the war as unnecessary tragedy. So schools of history who frame the war as Union overreach have used that day to push their narrative. But it began as an act of reverence and honor, and an act of joyful remembrance of solidarity and liberation. It's important to connect the holidays we celebrated today to that chain of events related to the Union soldiers. Over time, Memorial Day and Decoration Day separated. Decoration Day, as it is done in Appalachia and the South, is for everyone. Everyone goes to the graves of their kin, tidies them up, and leaves flowers. But Memorial Day reshapes this from honoring one's own kin toward honoring those who sacrificed their lives for the freedom of others. And those Union soldiers who went to South Carolina may or may not have intended to fight for the freedom of Black Americans, but those who were freed did see it that way, and they took it upon themselves to do the work the kin of the dead could not do, since they were buried so many miles from home. And so this is a spiritual counter-narrative to Confederate Memorial Day. And it's also a counter-narrative to those versions of Memorial Day that valorize the violence itself. Memorial Day, as descended from that moment in South Carolina in 1865, connects that war to the ongoing resistance of those who have been suffering under tremendous violence. Because in 1860, the United States was already a place of extreme violence and terror. Anti-democratic forces strove to control the political process, and the Southern tyrannical regime was enforced through brutality. I'm indebted in my thinking to a 2013 article in The Atlantic by Ta-Nehisi Coates, where he points out that America did not go to war in 1860. In 1860, America was attacked by a formidable rebel faction seeking to protect the expansion of slavery. That faction did not simply want slavery to continue in America. They dreamed of a tropical empire of slavery encompassing Cuba, Nicaragua, and perhaps the whole of South America. This faction was not only explicitly pro-slavery, but explicitly anti-democratic. The newly declared Confederacy attacked America not because it was being persecuted, but because it was unable to win a democratic election. And so in this framework, I think it becomes clearer that the Civil War was not a sudden tragedy or a failure of diplomacy, but an eruption of overt violence into the lives of white Euro-Americans who had not yet had to confront that violence in their own daily lives. The war had been ongoing for some time. Historian Joanne B. Friedman spent many years researching violence in American politics during this period. She combed through journals and letters. It was common for legislators to throw punches, for lawmakers to brawl in the halls. They brought guns to work and threatened each other. The beating of Charles Sumner at the hands of Preston Brooks was just one of many incidents. And beyond the halls of government, there were brawls and riots at voting booths. And if war is politics by other means, antebellum politics are arguably war by other means. Moreover, the Confederate States enforced the social order through tremendous violence. People who have been enslaved and deprived of their freedoms do not tolerate that situation because of some legal argument. It is because violence is enacted upon them. Social order is upheld through guns and chains. And centuries of slave rebellions are a powerful argument for the idea that there had been a civil war in motion since 1619. So in this regard, the transition to open warfare with armies and soldiers is not abrupt. It is the natural extension of violence into other venues, an eruption into a sharper form of what was already happening. And the illiberalism that preceded the war may be familiar to many of us. The idea that if one loses a democratic election, it is appropriate to respond with violence. The idea that not being able to oppress others will lead to oneself being oppressed. The belief that utilizing the power of the state is for me to do and not for the other to do to me. In the footage of January 6th, there's a moment when a woman bemoans the fact that she was targeted by police, and she says, "The police are there to enact violence on other people, not on me." And this is an inadvertent acknowledgement of a powerful truth, that all of our arguments about war and peace, policing and legislation, all of this is disagreement about when to engage in violence, not if. And so those thousands of years of just war theory and arguing about our political structures are essentially arguing about who gets to decide and when they get to decide. The Reconstruction period was a tremendous backlash. In the interests of order and quiet, if not peace, Southern states were allowed to reinstitute measures of control, to once again impose state violence on Black Americans. Before the war, the abolition movement had a subsection, a fairly strong one, that was tightly bound with the pacifist movement. Thinkers and activists such as William Lloyd Garrison and our own UU forebear, Aiden Ballou, saw government as an essentially corrupt instrument of violence and imperialism. And so prior to the Civil War, they believed and argued that slavery could not be ended by means of war, but only by a social revolution. As the country did ultimately move toward war, most of those reformers changed their mind. They realigned with the federal government, seeing in the Lincoln administration hope for real change, and in the end, only our own Aiden Ballou was left standing, lonely, in his opposition to government and to war. And his argument was that the power of the state could never change how we actually live. That in order for society to change, our own hearts and minds must change. And so he advocated what he called moral suasion, convincing the opposition that a position is the correct moral one, because he thought that no instrument of violence could ever ultimately create peace, and that the aftermath would always contain the seeds of violence that preceded it. And this is, of course, an absolutist and utopian argument. And Ballou is known as much for his failed utopian community as he is for his pacifism and his abolitionism. In response to similar contemporary arguments, ethicist Sharon Welch says that the purity and absoluteness of this guideline to do no harm is a recipe for illusion and paralysis. Doing nothing does harm. Our neutrality helps the oppressors more than the victims of oppression. And moreover, she notes that non-lethal means of coercion are still coercion. Economic and social domination can be as violent as physical domination and come with similar risks and similar costs. And yet, observing the failure of our reunited nation to ensure civil and social liberty, to enable Black Americans to fully participate in public life, suggests that Ballou was onto something. As Reconstruction collapsed, massive swaths of the United States reverted to their pre-war forms, with both state-sanctioned and unofficial violence enforcing the status quo. The actual work and labor required to achieve material change faltered, and it failed. Policies of appeasement, for the sake of order, allowed the powerful to return to a violent regime and name it peace. James Luther Adams is our great 20th century Unitarian theologian, and he was shaped and formed by his experiences in Germany during the rise of fascism. And while he was there in Germany in the 20s and 30s, he admired how much the most orthodox churches stood up to fascism and to Hitler. And he despaired at the collaboration and appeasement he saw among the liberal churches. And he was afraid that liberal religion did not make sufficient demands of its people, and that it did not do enough to shape our hearts and minds. He looked around and he said, "What is it in my preaching and political action that would stop this?" He asked himself what he had done that could prevent this from happening. And he recognized in himself a need for metanoia, for conversion. And by this, he meant a complete and total reorientation of values. His experiences in Germany were so powerful that he wrote about it over and over again. He spoke of it frequently. And when he was teaching classes over across the street at Harvard or down the way at Andover Newton, he would make all of his classes spend a session watching documentary footage and demand that his students engage with the realities of evil. For Adams, history was essentially tragic. Flawed human beings are always caught between connection and domination. And so the purpose of church for Adams, perhaps especially in this, the most liberal of churches, is metanoia as a continuing process. As revelation continues to unfold, so do our hearts continue to convert. He says there should be an increasing awareness, a raising of consciousness with regards to the evils around us. And he calls the liberal churches to commitment in the face of wrongs and evils. And so from this perspective, nonviolence has to be a tactic more than an end in itself. Nonviolence exposes the fact that violence already exists, and it makes clear the demands placed on those of us who may have yet to commit. And from this perspective, from Adam's perspective, war is the result of that tragic split in our human nature. It emerges from wrongs that go farther back than the violence of war itself, and we are called to resist by any means that could lead us past those wrongs, beyond it, understanding that work cannot be completed by the ending of a war, and that we must understand that the work will always continue. And we must perpetually reshape ourselves and the world around us into something better, to reorient ourselves and our communities towards mutuality and interdependence. Ta-Nehisi Coates is very clear that violence did not suddenly begin in 1860. And he's also very clear that the Civil War, was a complex and ambiguous undertaking. But he says, here is something I always come back to. In 1859, legally selling someone's 5-year-old child was big business. In 1866, it was not. And in today's contemporary world, whatever the merits of Ukraine's counteroffensive, the fact is that without fierce resistance, Ukraine would be folded into Russia, attempting to reconstitute its imperial territorial breadth. There are no good wars. We know this. We know that every war represents a failure, be it moral, political, historical. Yet we also know and recognize that there are times when the appearance of peace is undergirded by a lack of justice and a lack of freedom. There are moments in our history and even in our present where past mistakes cannot be redeemed without physical resistance. And in the midst of those moments and all their confusion and complication, they can be difficult to define. But Memorial Day is an opportunity to ponder what they might be. The American Civil War, World War II, and actions that resist colonialism and imperialism can sometimes be recognizable in part and in hindsight. And they suggest that self-determination and solidarity might be a guiding metric for thinking about how to engage with violence that is already in motion. Memorial Day also demands that we look at our history with nuance and hold it with some ambiguity, to remember our dead wisely and well in all of their nuance and complexity. Memorial Day, remembered in this way, calls us to resist easy nationalism or simple allegiance to country, and to understand ourselves as moral actors in the world. And so now, as we move a little bit towards Pride Month, as we move closer to Juneteenth, we can hold a few simultaneous truths. There is joy in resistance, and there are joyful victories. The freed folks of South Carolina marched in a parade. Black Texans will shortly be having their own parades and picnics, and queer folk will soon be throwing parties, and there is no shame in rejoicing in increased peace and increased freedom. But we enter into that joy also holding memory, remembrance of those who went before us, of those who suffered, and those who died along the way. And so we enter into our joys also holding hope for a more just world, a more free world, understanding that if there is indeed to be peace on the other side of conflict and violence, it demands that we reorient ourselves. It demands that we reorient ourselves to change this world, to act earlier, to act with greater commitment, to lean into our mutuality and interdependence, so that someday we might indeed learn to be beyond violence and war.